All right, welcome everybody. Here we are today at the Freedom Hub Working Group. We're pretty excited with a great guest today. And before we get started, just as a reminder, this and all the videos are available on our channel. It's a case sensitive. It's bit.ly/ and then capital letters FHWG for Freedom Hub Working Group. FHWG channel, CHANNEL, and you'll see all the collection there. And also remember that this program is sponsored by yourfreedomhub.com, so you're going to want to see there where we're uniting freedom activists and entrepreneurial disruptors for a better world. Very exciting place to be. We're excited today because we've got with us a fellow who's got a really interesting situation going on here, and I'm going to actually have Charles do the honors of giving us an introduction here.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome, Bob. Charlie Froman here, and it's my privilege to welcome Bob Bowdon from choicemedia.tv, his website, if you want to check him out. He's an aggregator of news on school choice, but he's much more than that. When I met him, I think I was helping Governor Gary Johnson's nonprofit, Our America Initiative, and maybe before then even, going back to the 2000s, sometime around which he made this well-received documentary called The Cartel. And the vision that I still have in memory from that is the gymnasium or something, Bob, full of basically lower middle class women crying because the lottery ran out of spaces for their kid to escape the local zip code school that was not pleasing whatever they wanted for their kid, and they couldn't get into a charter school. And it just goes to show you that school choice just isn't an effort by upper middle class people to have the taxpayer subsidize their private school, but really it's a serious need for women of all and parents in general for what their kids need for a better education. So that's what Bob does. He has engineering degrees from Purdue and Stanford. And he was an anchor, a news anchor. So he has been in the media covering news of all sorts, but I'll be curious, Jeff, to hear why education, of all the issues he's covered over the years, why is he still with us in such a big way? So that's our introduction, Jeff.
Fantastic. All right, Bob, on that note, I'm going to have you actually become the master of the screen again.
All right, everybody. Thanks to Jeff and Charlie for this introduction. It's a pleasure to speak with everybody and kind of lay out, as well as the people watching in the future, and to kind of lay out what we're doing at Choice Media. So it's correct. I was first an engineer, then I had a career change and became a media guy, first a television producer and reporter and anchor and host, and then later a documentary filmmaker. And I got started in that regard by having a friend who was a high school English teacher in an inner city high school in New York City. And I started hearing on a daily basis some stories about things that were going on in American high schools, and thought to myself, I don't think a lot of people know, like the things I'm hearing, I don't think they're widely known. Someone needs to tell these stories. And so I embarked on trying to tell the story of the dysfunction in American public education. And having been an engineer, I wanted to kind of tell it as a system story, not so much as anecdotes of individual people. And I particularly didn't want my work dismissed as, oh, look at that one bad school over there, or that one unfortunate principal or teacher over there. And isn't it sad that those people have a, dysfunctional scenario or are somehow their education's not working out. Oh, well, I guess it's sad for them. I wanted to tell the story of a broken system. So that's what I attempted to do with The Cartel. And the documentary film really just exploded, I think, by most virtually any definition. It won a dozen film festival awards, a national theatrical release, Warner Brothers distribution. And for a completely independent film, getting a major studio distribution deal is considered virtually a miracle. And so while I'm proud of the work, it was also, I think the timing was also happened to be perfect for people ready to hear that message. So then as I proceeded around the country speaking and showing the film and appearing on television and radio shows and whatnot, people kept often asking me, well, what's your next film going to be? Assuming I would kind of do the Michael Moore model of moving from one topic to the next. I would then have my immigration film, or I'd then have my drug war film, or I'd then have a film about foreign war or something like that. And I just kept thinking to myself, this issue, I am not done with this. This still is compelling. It's still, to me, it is the least covered subject in the American media. There are enormous fights underway, everything from teacher strikes to fights about school choice, private school choice, and charter school caps and moratoria, and all kinds of vigorous debates. And so I thought, well, I don't want to just keep making sequels of the original documentary film. What would make sense to do in the aughts decade, if you'll accept that term? What would make sense from a media standpoint to do? Like maybe in the 50s, I would have made a radio show. In the 70s, maybe a TV station or something, or syndicated TV show. And in the 90s, it might have been a cable network. But in 2010, what made sense or 2011, would be to launch an online news platform. So that's what we did with Choice Media. It's my effort to talk about these issues. And I'm about to show you just some of the issues that I hope to convince you guys, that whoever's watching, that this issue is, it still is it's suffering profound problems, costing enormous amounts of money. And I wanted to lay out kind of the work we're doing. So let's begin. This is my second screen here. Now this just came out. This is, you're looking at if I can make sure my windows are properly aligned here. These are the NAEP statistics, they're called. That's the Nation's Report Card is also kind of its more conventional colloquial title. It's administered by the U.S. Department of Education. These are tests given to, in all 50 states. They are demographically adjusted. And here we have proficiency rates. I don't know that this is much of a mystery to the people watching this. If you want to remember this data at a cocktail party or Thanksgiving dinner table or Christmas party you might be attending or some other holiday function, it's pretty easy, 34%. That's the reading and math proficiency of 8th graders in America right now, based on our own national tests that we give. Or you can just remember a third, because that's essentially how many students are proficient today. So we can start right there. In some ways, I could end the presentation right now. 2/3 of American students are not proficient in reading, and 2/3 are not proficient in math, as we go into what will obviously be an increasingly technological world economy. So let's move on, though, and show some other data from around the country, because some might say, well, these tests, how do we know, we're against too much testing, and how do we know how these tests are framing the things we need to learn? Well, you could look at graduation rate, for example. That would be one way to look at something, starting with the District of Columbia. And look at the media narrative of this. Hold steady in 2019, it says. Well, what does hold steady mean? Well, at the bottom of the screen there, hold steady shows you that 65% of the students in they say the traditional system, that means the students not in the charter schools of District of Columbia, the district schools, the traditional public schools, the non-charter schools, 65% is the graduation rate. In 2019, this is not a third world country. This is telling us that not even a third, not even 2/3 of kids, in other words, are finishing with a high school diploma. And you've got to wonder what kinds of job prospects they will have, for the future. To move to a state figure here, here's New Mexico. Now look at this. It says 50 out of 50, so it is the last ranking. But here we have a statewide figure of 71% high school graduation rate, statewide. So again, it's almost a third of kids in an American state not even having a high school degree. I want to digress for 1 second and actually show you guys a website for some statistics about Chicago and how that district is doing. Clicking over to here, if I can find my, let's see here. Chicago graduated more seniors this year. That sounds positive, doesn't it? Wow, that sounds great. Till you scroll down and see, oh, this good news, what is it? It means that the graduation rate went from 78.2% to 78.9%. So a graduation rate this is just high school diplomas with not even 80% of the kids getting high school diplomas in Chicago, they have the temerity to describe that as graduated more seniors. Or take this, for example, dissecting the soaring graduation rate for black boys in Chicago. This is from the NPR affiliate in Chicago. You see that it goes from 47 to 65%. So again, 65% is the black male high school graduation rate. They call that soaring. That's their sort of brag, if you will. But so let me click back here to my presentation I had going and show you this next slide. Here we go. I'm going to play. So this is what happens after the teacher strike. You see that they have 65% of black boys graduating. But so based on the strike, though, what they did is award themselves 244. They can basically bankroll 244 unused sick days. That's almost an entire year, in other words, of work days that they can bankroll. And furthermore, they also did other things. They made sure in this new contract after the teacher strike that charter enrollment could not grow more than 1%, and that they would get 16% raises. Now, it was called by the media 16% raises. In fact, that's not counting the step raises they just get for meeting milestones in their career. So they get automatic raises at a certain year, like 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary, 15-year anniversary. The 16% raise was on top of those step raises. And plus, they can now bank almost a year of sick days. Let's talk about New York City and their rubber room. A teacher has been paid $1.7 million after 20 years. This teacher has not taught in 20 years. The teacher in 1998 or 98, 99 was this man's last school year. He made $39,000 that year. He now is paid to not teach because he can't be fired because of tenure. His salary is now over $132,000 a year. And he's still on the payroll of New York City public schools. He still is not teaching every day. He's doing nothing and getting paid that much by the taxpayers. We have this, a federal bill, an anti-violence bill. Now, this is from a Texas Republican, John Cornyn, U.S. Senator, who basically calls this the Restoring, Enhancing, Strengthening, and Promoting Our Nation's Safety Efforts or Response. This basically would say that they should create this national database of student emails and calendar entries and text messages under the guise of protecting safety. And you might say, well, this hasn't passed yet. Big deal. Maybe this is just sort of a bill. Who cares? Well, I'll tell you what has passed. Already in 1,400 schools across the country, this company known as Gaggle, which sounds like Google, but is not the same. This company called Gaggle is already collecting data from students who cannot opt out in 1,400 schools across America under the guise of keeping them from doing harm or school shootings or preventing suicide is how they justify it. And who owns this data? It's not even clear. It's not clear if one of these kids runs for office in 20 years from now, if their political opponent can buy what that kid might have said when they were a 16-year-old high school kid to try to disparage them somehow, or a divorcing spouse, etc. Moving on, we have this. Now, this is a commentary we recorded last week from Shauna Bullock, who's a House of Representatives member in Arizona, but she's here talking about, and I hope the audio plays, she's talking about what happened in the Austin, Texas school district with response to their sex ed curriculum. And a quick note, like, we all have different views on what we believe kids should be taught about sex and what age is the right appropriate for what appropriate information for what for whatever age. We may have different views on that, but here's what Representative Bullock said.
Hi, my name is Shauna Bullock. I currently serve in the Arizona House of Representatives. The story I chose has to deal with progressive activists pushing sex education in Austin's district schools. Austin is not alone because it is happening right here in Arizona. Sex education curriculum encompasses the teachings of anatomy, sexual reproduction, intercourse, reproductive health, rights, and responsibilities. The graphic material contained in this curriculum will make any high schooler blush. So why is Austin Independent School District pushing this on our 8-year-olds? This sex ed curriculum is being pushed by not only the local level, but by Planned Parenthood at the national level throughout the country. This material includes everything from showing young children explicit material, how to obtain an abortion, and how to get an abortion without the consent of a parent. A lot of these new sex ed policies being pushed at the school board level are opt-outs, not opt-ins. I believe more families will choose school choice with the advent of this new sex ed curriculum. For more stories like this, please visit choicemedia.tv on a daily basis.
Okay, the point of bringing this up is not that I am, have a particular view I want to tell you is the right view about what age to teach what to kids, but that a lot of social agendas are now being given to kids without their parents' consent. So moving on, I want to talk more about federalization efforts. Now this, Kamala Harris, you might have learned about this. All these news stories are in the last couple of weeks, by the way. You see the date on this is from last week. And the school day, she wants basically a federal program to make the school day till 6 p.m. across the country. Of course, education doesn't appear in the Constitution at all. In fact, some might argue the U.S. Department of Education is clearly extra constitutional as a result of the 10th Amendment. And yet we have these kinds of initiatives going on as well. And now this is also sort of back to the idea that I spoke a second ago about, but this is a suggestion that woke history, what they say, is making inroads into American high schools. And again, you may have your own view about what to teach kids about America, but you can see here that this is a real clear investigations piece about how children are increasingly being taught that, about what they call intergenerational trauma, heteropatriarchy, and whiteness, and the degree to which white privilege is sort of a toxic factor in America. These kinds of concepts, we can all pick and choose which ones we personally believe, but the fact that they are being taught to children without parents' consent is very problematic to a lot of parents. Let's talk a little about school discipline. And what I'm just attempting to show you is the enormity of what's going on in some of the troubling trends in American education today. This was from September. It basically says that in California, you won't be able to expel or suspend disruptive kids. And they will begin applying this new philosophy called restorative discipline, where if a kid is acting up in school, they will remove the ability for the teacher or the principal to really take the kind of level of action that I think many of us would consider appropriate for violent kids. And so to that end, here's a story from as long ago as today. This is a story from today where every school in a particular Wisconsin school district was closed after a student had a loaded gun and wrote a hit list, very actionable list of what he was going to do to shoot up the school. So we have while these kinds of disciplinary issues are happening, and even calling this disciplinary is probably a misnomer. This is beyond that. This is, arguably felonious. And yet you have issues like you have restorative discipline efforts where they're basically trying to prevent the schools from taking the kinds of actions they need. One last note on school discipline, just to show you this. This is from last week.
A Texas substitute teacher has been fired and arrested after video surfaced online that appears to show her repeatedly punching a student. We need to tell you.
Yeah, can you increase the volume a little?
All right.
The incident happened at Lehman High School.
See if I can boost it this way.
A Texas substitute teacher has been fired and arrested after video surfaced online that appears to show her repeatedly punching a student. We need to tell you, though, the video is violent, so it might be hard to watch. The incident happened at Lehman High School in Kyle, so that's near Austin. The video shows 32-year-old Tiffany Shadell Langford approaching a 16-year-old girl and punching her in the face. The substitute teacher then continues hitting this girl as others look in shock of what's happening. In an email to parents on Friday, the school principal said, in part, under no circumstance is that behavior tolerated. The school district says Langford is charged with aggravated assault. So now the governor now tweeting about...
I'll stop that now. The governor weighed in, as you might expect of Texas, talking about conduct like that is not acceptable. So these are some of the discipline issues. Now understand there is some degree of school choice in America, depending on where you live, but by far the majority of parents have no way to choose other schools apart from potentially homeschooling, you might argue. Of course, many parents don't feel as if they are academically suited for homeschooling. And so there are by far most Americans have no private school choice programs and no charter school options. Now, another issue, of course, is the fiscal conditions of our schools. And just to hit on this briefly, I just wanted to show you about how around the country, teacher pensions are embroiled in all kinds of, let me go back to the play note here. So crises, whether you're looking at Chicago, New Jersey, Kentucky, in fact, many people believe the Kentucky governor just lost his reelection for the reason that he was trying to fix the teacher pension problem in that state and wanted teachers to pay a little bit more into the pension problem to stop the crisis, but including California and in many, many states. In fact, we have this story from the University of Pennsylvania website calling it a time bomb inside public pension plans. And what they said is that Moody's last year put public pensions underfunded by $4.4 trillion. Now, it's not just teachers, it's all public pensions in that number, but the majority is teacher pensions. 4.4 trillion is not the size of the pension plans. That's how much they're underfunded, 4.4 trillion. That's the size of the German economy. In fact, they said, and that was a year ago, they said if you just round off to an increase of 5 trillion by now and divide that by the 158 million American workers in the workforce, what you get is $32,000 for each American worker. And most American workers don't have $32,000 saved up for their own retirements, let alone $32,000 in addition to their own retirements to also pay for government worker underfunded retirements. But that is the fiscal scenario we're facing right now in America. And so I wanted to also show a few other quick things. This is how school districts have changed in the last 56 years. This is a new book out by Lindsay Burke and Jonathan Butcher. And this is a chart in that I highlighted and put it on Twitter. But it shows you basically, the administrators are often in charge of decisions on how to spend money, obviously, in terms of how to spend new money that comes into the schools. And you can see how they've decided to spend it mostly on themselves, new administrators and raises. And so administration has more than doubled in that period, whereas students are only up 40%. This is a teacher who wrote a piece just, I believe, last week. It says November 7th there. It says, I'm a teacher and a waste of money. If you read a commentary like this is a teacher describing his own point of view about how all these extra teachers were hired in the classroom to be secondary teachers on top of the original teachers. He says he's doing nothing. He says it's a waste of money. And these are the kind of commentaries I think most of America is not seeing when things happen like the Red for Ed teacher strikes or like the Chicago strike. So also wanted to point to generally this larger problem. The Catholic schools had a crisis of sexual abuse between 1 and 2 decades ago. The sexual abuse crisis in American public schools is unfolding as we speak. And we created a special URL called sexualabuseinschools.org. Anyone can try that themselves. Now, because of the word sexual, I think some people's browsers may not work. They maybe get blocked because of the word sexual, but you can always go to the Choice Media website and then click under our news banner here and just click on sexual abuse. Virtually everyone I've ever shown this to is dumbfounded by the sheer volume of sexual abuse stories happening in public schools. Any one of these you can click on and read more about and see all the details. I can pick one at random. Oklahoma teacher getting 5 years for rape. Let's just pick that in random. There you see the story. And that is something I just have to mention because people simply can't believe the size of this problem. All right, so going back to my presentation here, I wanted to leave with a little bit of a hopeful note, and as I wrap up, which is, this is a video we released last week. It's on a new kind of micro school called Prenda. It's in Arizona. It's rapidly expanding, and I just want to play like the first minute or so of that video, and I'll turn the volume up again in case that'll help, to show you something on a hopeful note of what we're seeing in American education. So here we go.
As we talk to parents, we're able to help them see that school could be something different.
MIT grad Kelly Smith got the idea to invent a new kind of micro school. So he did. It's called Prenda, and its growth in Arizona has been explosive.
I talked to my friends who had children and trusted me, and they pulled their kids out of school and sent them to my house every day. And we created a micro school, 7 children at the time. One of them was mine.
The first thing to know about Prenda is its growth trajectory. From that first group of just 7 kids, on a semester by semester basis, enrollment went to 20, then 30, then over 500. By the start of next year, they're expecting 1,000. The next thing to know is their rather untraditional school facilities.
We are in my house right here. And also we are at my children's school, not just my children, 8 additional children in addition to my 2 girls.
It's kind of a hybrid between homeschool and traditional school. You get the socialization, you get the curriculum like a traditional school, but you get the homeschool feel.
Each Prenda school has only 5 to 10 students, and to some who work there, it represents the education version of a larger techno-cultural trend.
Think about Uber and the fact that it allows a normal person to own a taxi, and you think about Airbnb and the way it allows a normal person to own a hotel. Prenda allows a normal person to run a school.
My son's class previously was like 35 kids to 1 teacher. So it's quite the drastic extremes that way.
I was a regular public school teacher, and then I became a guide at Prenda, and I went from having 150 students to having 9, which is incredible. And in the first week, I was able to meet with every student one-on-one to curate and create curriculum that was at their level, which was something I've never been able to do in my teaching career.
So I'll stop it there. So that's the Prenda video we released last week, and I would call that a super hopeful development in and not just Prenda in particular, but the micro school movement is something that, you know, as they laid out very well in the soundbite, it's that you have a homeschool feel, but you also have cutting edge curriculum from online learning sources, and then you also have a socialization of other kids, but all with socio-emotional needs being met in a small group setting. So I wanted to feature that as well. So that's kind of my after all this terrible news, I wanted to end on that a bit of positive note. But Choice Media, we are a website. We're a weekly email blast. We have also a mobile app, and anyone with a cell phone can type in Choice Media and download our free mobile app, which is really the coolest thing we have. It also allows access to our weekly podcasts and others. We curate something called Education Podcast Central. So I co-host a podcast called The Learning Curve, which is available basically everywhere you can get podcasts. But the Choice Media smartphone app has that and other podcasts. And so we encourage you to learn more about this subject. I feel everyone in the range of my voice ought to be an advocate for education reform, ought to be more knowledgeable about this very important issue. And that's our mission. And so for now, thanks for your time. And I think there might be some Q&A, or that's kind of what I have for my presentation. So
excellent. Excuse me. I was going to say, yeah, it's super important. Obviously, education is the crux of everything in the country. So for this to be off the charts, everything that follows behind is going to be bad. And, you know, it's interesting how the mirror image of whatever it is our problem is the same. So in that one slide you showed all those administrators compared to the kids. And if we mirror that in the medical world, that's the administrators compared to the patients or doctors. So yes, it's the same exact problem. And, you know, hopefully it's going to hit more as things have been trying in the medical field. But just like Uber, you know, killed the taxis and whatnot, you know, here this fellow thought up this Prenda. Well, that's what it's going to take, is when you can figure out how to turn it into a profit center for someone else to try to do this, especially someone that cares, which is what you really want. You know, these other people that are just trying to bank their, you know, sick days or whatever, they're more focused on themselves, obviously, than the kids. That's obvious. So it's great to see that stuff. And that's the market, you know, fixing the problem as usual. We just got to figure out how to keep the government at bay for sure. So let's grab some questions here. We've got some hands popping up. So let's go to David. I've got you there.
Thank you, Jeff. Bob, this is David Pratt Demarest with Roads to Freedom Foundation.
Hi, David.
Hi. I've been an advocate of education reform since grade school back in the 1950s. We know many things that are wrong with public education. The question is how to fix it. As a student, self-education was my solution of choice. As an adult, separation of state and education is my solution of choice. So what are your thoughts on how to achieve that goal, and what can we do in the private sector to denationalize public education?
Mm-hmm. What state are you in, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay. Well, Nebraska is one of those states without much in the way of school choice. And so while like a lot of libertarians, I too, I'm a libertarian, but I also believe that it would be great to have full freedom in education. You know, the transition to that world will not happen overnight. Public schools are a big part of American society. And so I think when thinking about how to create public policy as a bridge to a freer world of education, I think the more choice, the better. And so that means I support and advocate for charter schools, for voucher programs, for education savings accounts, for tax credit scholarship programs, for online learning programs. Florida, for example, has a Florida virtual school where every student in the state, it doesn't matter even if you're at a public school, private school, parochial school, or charter school, or homeschool. Every child in the state of Florida is allowed to take a course online. So that means if you just don't like your Algebra 2 teacher in your high school, that one course you can opt out of and not take it in your high school and take that course online, and it's free, and it counts as full credit in your high school transcripts. So there are, I say that by way to imply that there are lots of ways to introduce more free markets into education, into the existing public education labyrinth, if you will. And so we really have 50 separate state stories. Different, you know, Arizona and Florida are the two states that are furthest along in terms of offering different options to parents. And I'm sorry to say, but Nebraska is one of the states that has made the least progress in that regard. I spoke in Omaha a few years ago, and you know, it's certainly the case that the student proficiencies in Nebraska are no better than those national statistics you saw. And yet there are no private school choice programs in Omaha, and I believe no charter schools in Nebraska. I mean to say. So it's a long-winded way of saying, to me, the answer to the question is finding different states need to find kind of legislative remedies that are passable, that you can get through a legislature. And then once they're through, you then increase their size, increase their footprint. And that can include online learning programs, charter school programs, private school choice programs. The more of all of those that get passed by state legislatures, the closer we are to a fuller, more kind of the real eventual goal of educational freedom.
Is there somebody currently teaching, you know, individuals or organizations to try to make that happen, giving them like the templates to drive that type of activity?
Sure. Anyone listening who might have an interest in pushing their state legislature or a particular legislator that, to do these kinds of things can contact American Federation for Children. That group does exactly what you described. There's a group called Excel in Ed, which you can reach out to. There's also a group called edchoice.org, which you can reach out to. All of those groups, and leaving out some others, depends what your interest is. If your interest is in creating a charter school program, maybe you feel that charter schools isn't the most educational freedom, but it's the one you can get past in your state. Then you could contact the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Or maybe you think that an online learning program is something that you could build a coalition for and build advocates for. And then there are online learning groups as well. So there are lots of groups, really. It's really no shortage of organizations ready with sample legislation, for example, that you could actually copy and then make changes as you saw fit for your local state and go forward with. But yeah, a good starting point would either be American Federation for Children or edchoice.org.
Very good. Charles, I see you have your hand up.
I do, and fantastic presentation, Bob. 3 questions. We'll take them. I'll ask them all, and then we can take them one at a time. The first, Earl, if I can have you unmute yourself, I'll put you on the spot and just hold your fire as I finish the questions. What do you see in the universities from this output about which Bob has complained? And before you answer, the other two questions, Bob, will be, what about this middle-class entitlement mentality, barring reform? Whether it's healthcare, as Jeff mentioned, with people thinking Medicare for all is going to help them escape these awful insurance prices, or the local zip code school that's having upper middle class people block charters here in Virginia.
Sure.
That's the one question. And some folks think Bevin lost in Kentucky because he took on the sacred cow of Republican voters, their local government school. And finally, the third question, and we can take these one at a time, is, I taught in a DC's charter system for 3 years. I left lobbying for a while. And it was great on the one hand, but it was really awful. Just so tough teaching that cohort.
I bet.
But when I was doing my master's, I really got into John Taylor Gatto and the radical thinkers who are basically saying the same thing. You got to move to student-led learning. So the third question is, talk a bit more about that Uber example you gave on the final slide there. To what extent are these smaller, more innovative private education solutions really responding to the evidence which shows you gotta motivate the kids by letting them kind of find their interest and follow it versus a top-down curriculum fixation that everyone seems to have mistakenly? So the first question is Earl, universities. Second, what about these wealthy people that love their local government school? And the third is, well, it's not just about standards, it's about radical student-led learning like democratic schools. Earl, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I recognize two things that were said. Number one, the increase in administration is just phenomenal, and it's certainly true at universities. In fact, it probably explains a lot of the increase in university costs too. But the other thing is, because I've now taught long enough that I've seen multiple generations of students arrive at my classrooms, and I've taught at a number of different universities, I do think that in recent years I've begun to notice a degrading to some extent of the ability of the students in the classrooms that I've got to think. I think the decline in quality of education in the high schools is beginning to be noticeable even after you've selected out just the students who are going on to college. So those are the two things that I would comment on that we heard today that seem accurate.
Sure, you can simply go no further than to look at some of the old tests that were used 50 and 100 years ago. Some people have published those to kind of compare them to tests from today. And the comparisons are stark. You can see what kids had to know in 8th grade back in 1905, for example, on a test. And the level of depth of information is just profoundly higher than we see today even to a 12th grader today in terms of what they're asked to know. Also, for example, the remedial course rate that students basically who sometimes finish valedictorians, and there are these stories where they go to college and they either flunk out or else they are assigned to all these remedial courses, and you're like, this was the valedictorian. I mean, I think there's examples. It's just a replete with examples like I'm describing. I mean, is that what I'm not sure if I'm addressing what the question is, but yeah, I mean, I kind of thought the question was more about colleges in terms of teacher preparation, but maybe I'm wrong in what the question meant. But so.
Yeah, well, I haven't noticed any problems in terms of teacher preparation. So, you're talking about university.
Yeah, I mean, what I've found is a lot of times that the schools of education will graduate students to be teachers, and they have not heard from one single person mention school choice or private schools or charter schools or vouchers or any of those words at all. And in some degrees, some ways, schools of education are almost factories for, pumping out, teacher union advocates based on the information that they're fed. I've spoken at schools of education and had, and heard from some, and been on the stage with some professors of education, for example, who, for whom all of this concept of even just differentiated salaries, paying the very best, a penny more than the very worst or the average teacher is considered heretical to many of the people in education generally and in schools of education in particular, as if that's not commonplace in every other profession we have. But that's treated as if it just could never be done because we don't have a perfect way to assess all of these teachers. And until there's a perfect way to assess them all, there can be zero differentiation of salary. Even if you're extremely hard to find and hardworking AP math and science teacher, or if you are the worst of the worst in terms of a kind of a teacher that is, very easy to find. The orthodoxy will tell you that we can't pay them any different. And yet this would be laughed at if you mentioned this idea to handle software programmers that way, or lawyers should all be paid the same, or doctors should be all paid the same, or accountants should all be paid the same, or any other profession should all be paid the same regardless of their work output. It would be laughed at, and yet it's considered absolutely required in the world of education, which is it's absurd. It's actually, to me, it's bordering on a form of insanity. It's a dementia to believe that you can't pay the best people more than the worst people, and yet we have that in America in 2019.
Can I follow up quickly with a question, related to that? If you had to select just one item to be the most important impediment to improving education in the United States today, would that thing be the teacher union lobbies and so on? What is this? If you had to pick one, maybe I'll ask the question this way: if you could get one wish, just do one thing, what would that one thing be that would be most effective?
The one thing would be parents would have control of the money that is paid for their children's education. So in other words, a universal, it's most commonly would be thought of as a universal voucher, but there's this new concept called education savings accounts, which is kind of a voucher 2.0. And that idea says, vouchers is where the government sets the tuition level at one fixed amount. And then there's no pricing pressure on schools because all schools get the same amount. If you bring the voucher to them, that's the set amount the government has said. Education savings accounts allows for a parent to allocate a certain amount of money to private school tuition and maybe some other portion of that money to a private tutor, or some other portion of that money to an educational online course, or saving for college, or other educational ways. So ESAs, as they're known, education savings accounts, are kind of like flexible vouchers, if you want to think of them that way. And so if you're asking me what the one reform would be, I would have universal, meaning there's no eligibility requirements. Every student is eligible. Universal education savings accounts, where if a parent chooses the public school, the money they can direct the money to the public school. If they choose a private school, a religious school, a charter school, an online school, wherever they choose, those different schools charge tuition based on their costs, and the parent can make a decision about what makes the most sense for that child. And that would be the reform I would propose.
Okay.
Is there some legislation underway in that regard already for such a thing?
We have a few in the country. So Arizona has the first, what's called ESA, Education Savings Account, but it's limited to only certain categories of, so either special needs kids or children of military families, which they very slyly worked into they kind of figured the opposition wouldn't oppose military families, as well as kids in D or F rated public schools. And there are a couple other eligibility groups like Native Americans, kids and stuff like that. So Arizona has what I'm saying right now, but it's not universal, as we say. It is restricted eligibility. So there are also other ESA programs in a couple other states. Florida has one and Tennessee has one. And those programs right now are small, though. Arizona's is the largest ESA program. And even all of them, it's only a few 4 or 5 states, depending on how you count what an ESA is, that have it at all. So most places, this does not exist.
Interesting. Dr. Singleton, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this talk. I wanted to make folks aware of something that we just learned at a meeting the other day. I'm from California, And there is a group that was started here called faireducation.org. And the reason this started is in the Santa Barbara schools, they segregated the white children from the minority children, and the minority children are taught the hierarchy of oppression. White males oppress minority males, males oppress women, etc., etc. And
This sounds unbelievable to me.
At-
what district was this?
If you didn't know that it was true, and how it came about is there was a little white boy who had a Hispanic last name, and he was segregated in with the Hispanics. So he came home crying. And these are young children. We're not talking high school. These were third, fourth grade children.
Okay.
And
Actually, so I'm sorry, you said faireducation.org?
yes, faireducation.org. And you
look that up right now. Go ahead.
Look this up. The attorney, they're suing Santa Barbara schools now for using this group. It's called Just, as in justice, Just Communities. And they are who are teaching this program, and they're trying to do it in schools. And you had mentioned this restorative justice. That's one of the things is that Mexican children get restorative justice, and they don't get punished, but the white children will get punished.
So, all right, so I'm on your site now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Where will I go to see the story to which you referred?
It should be in there. Because frankly, I haven't looked at it on the site. I heard the speaker.
Okay. Do you know what? I'm sorry. What school district was this?
Santa Barbara.
Okay.
Which is Central California. And the attorney who was running the case is a fellow named Jonathan Morse, and he's who gave the talk.
And so what would you suggest I search to pull this up? Santa Barbara School District.
Well, if you go back to where you were, the faireducation.org.
All right.
Probably scrolling through the website, they will tell the various programs, and I believe they point out this Just Communities.
Well, I'm there now. There is a tab called News and Resources. If I click that, it goes to,
there it is.
Sued over diversity training.
And that's what they're calling it, diversity training. I have a PowerPoint of this fellow, and I have no reason to believe he's making this up. And there's court documents and whatnot from the lawsuit, because people were so stunned that this was actually going on in the schools. So they've taken this social justice warriors to a new level.
Yeah.
And the kids aren't getting educated. Your statistic, they're having 34% proficiency, yet they're wasting all this time in schools creating racism where there is none.
No, I mean, it's a touchy subject, because you certainly don't want to come off to people that you're, insensitive to any acts of racism that might be real, that could be actual examples it's the real world, and all kinds of things happen. And so there's that. But at the same time, yes, we're in a world where some people some people believe that a boy can declare he's a girl, and that he really is therefore a girl because he's declared that, even if he then declares he's back to being a boy again the next day. And that other people honestly don't believe that. And so you have two groups of people, and generally both groups of people, I think, believe they're right. I don't think it's usually a faked point of view. They believe they're right. And so my view is the problem is when public schools use taxpayer money to force young children into one doctrinal set of beliefs in these kinds of regards, where you have authority figures like teachers, and you have government money and just the general fiat of government power used to pursue and push kind of a certain agenda of an answer to a question like that to children without even the parents knowing sometimes. And you can take whatever principled position you want on transgenderism and whether it's real or not, but yet that's just one example. All kinds of questions about what age to teach sex ed, and what to say about sex ed, and what to say about all kinds of other controversial factors in American life. How to teach the influence America's had on the world. Has America been a good force in the world or a bad force in the world? The way these kinds of things are framed is often subjective. And what I think many parents are finding is that there'll be a certain set of beliefs that are foisted onto children as you have to believe this way. And if you don't, then too bad, and we'll take your money anyway, and we'll ignore your thoughts or views on sensitive religious topics or social or cultural topics, and we'll force our point of view on you. And so I don't think you need to advocate for one or the other set of, all of these myriads of topics of how to teach, what to say about global warming and what to say about hundreds of other issues. I think the point is that schools have, schools where 2/3 of kids can't read and do math at proficiency levels. They're not doing math and reading at proficiency levels. Instead, you see these schools focused on these social agendas, which just seems crazy.
Thank you. And it certainly seems crazy to me as a minority person who went up through school speaking Spanish with my classmates and me speaking English, and we all got on just fine. And to suddenly start trying to divide people with this so-called training, it's very sickening to me, all with the parents' tax dollars.
Sure. Toxic masculinity and all kinds of other issues. Go ahead.
And as $3 million was what was put into this. And as you mentioned, this whole trend toward opting out rather than opting in. Any of this stuff, you should have to opt in.
Yeah, including schools.
Yes.
What's pretty amazing is how many people always say, "Oh, this is so abhorrent," and yet it's happening. So somebody must like it or be wanting a reason to push it. It's really interesting. It's like I've hardly anyone say it's a great thing. Charles,
most of the times people don't know.
Well, that too, for sure. Charles, I saw you had your hand up there.
Sure, Jeff. I know we're running out of time here pretty soon. A couple of my earlier questions didn't get really addressed, Bob. One is, despite some modest success with choice here and there, the fact remains, whether it's healthcare or education, the upper middle class really is wedded to the status quo. They love their local government school, just like they love Medicare. And that is such a barrier to getting choice. Comment on that, number one. And number two.
Well, let me do that one at a time, just so I
sure. Yeah, okay.
So on terms of that, you're absolutely right. And that I think choice advocates made strategic errors along the way by carving out certain geographical areas where we'll allow charter schools in like these inner city areas that, where it's really beyond obvious that the schools are dysfunctional. And so we'll let it there, and then we'll get that passed in state legislatures. How? Well, by not letting school choice in any regard happen in all these other areas. So we won't create enemies in most of the state that we're working in. We'll just have these narrow targeted little choice islands. Well, what they end up doing with that strategy is they limit their opponents, but they also limit their advocates. And I think what I've seen over and over again is when people design school choice initiatives to where everyone is eligible, yes, you do increase your opponents, but you also increase your potential advocates too. And if the concern sometimes is, well, that would be too much of a revolution. We can't overnight just overturn all of these districts and all, you can have a cap statewide. This is what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin. You can have a statewide school choice program that's capped at 1% of each school district. Don't worry, Chicken Little Sky is Falling person who claims this will be too disruptive and too much of a revolution. You can't complain too much when only 1% of your student body can leave this year for school choice. And by the way, next year it'll be 2%. And the year after that, it'll be 3%. And then it'll be 5%. And then it can be 10%. But the point is, if you make everyone eligible and you have just a cap, that is a much better way to answer the fears of revolution than by limiting geographically the potential beneficiaries. That way is a strategic error. But you're right. A lot of people, Texas is often thrown as an example of that. Like, look, you have a red state where there's hardly any school choice. There's no private school choice programs. Why would that be? But they tend to get passed in the purple states. We see private school choice programs like vouchers and education savings accounts passed in places where there are two parties that are jockeying back and forth for a power position, and the party that's a little out of power has a school choice initiative to try to win new support. When in a place like Texas, when it's basically just completely Republican controlled, you have all of these school districts with all these constituents for state legislators who like it the way it is. And by the way, their wife may work for the local public school, and their daughter may work for the local public school, or their son, and they have their own, they're compromised in their own way in terms of protecting the status quo. And so, that's a problem. And I think, I think that's a, but my only answer to that is that new online learning tools could prove so cheap and so good, some of these Prenda type models, that even at those places, you won't be able to stop the parents from leaving and just being their own complete private education providers through online tools, because that will be eventually the revolution. I think that will be unstoppable.
Yeah, that's the exciting part. David, I'm going to let you squeeze in one last question.
Thanks, Jeff. Bob, what will prevent online education, homeschooling, and private schools from solving public education problems faster behind the scenes than the political process?
What will keep, say the question again?
Why won't online education and homeschooling and private schools solve public education problems faster behind the scenes than using the political approach?
I think, one impediment is that right now it still requires a certain amount of adult involvement to motivate students to do the online work. And that if many parents have, the way they grew up is what they're used to, which is the school takes care of that. In some way, it's almost a de facto babysitter for certain kinds of kids. And there are too many parents who view it that way. And their view is, I'll go to work, you go to school, and then we'll meet later. And if you have a problem, you can tell me about it. What you're describing is a scenario that requires more parental involvement, to have kids being homeschooled and have parents staying on top of them. Did you do, what work did you do today? And, it's requiring a level of involvement. Some parents just aren't. So what will keep that from being the, instant revolution is that parents aren't involved enough. What could eventually make it a revolution anyway? The tools get so good, they'll be so engaging, kids will want to do it. And also they'll have these small group homeschool collectives like the Prenda model, where the parent doesn't need to literally be there because there's a small homeschool collective nearby and they're handling that motivational task to which I referred.
Short term, the political process faces the same constraints of public apathy. So I'm inclined to think that the private approach with good tools being developed is going to speed up the process.
Yeah, I think it'll speed up the process. Yeah, I don't disagree with that statement as you put it. Yeah, I think it's just look, right now, private school, 10% of kids are in private schools. About 1% though are in private school choice programs, meaning most of over 90% of the kids in private schools, the parents just pay out of pocket. So all that money they're paying for school system money doesn't go to them at all. That's just all that doesn't help their own families. It's 6% of kids are in charter schools nationally. So we have a footprint right now where something like between 80 and 84% of children are in traditional public schools, and too many parents are too apathetic to look for alternatives, and many don't even know alternatives are there, and many don't even know that even if alternatives aren't there, they could be possible if their state legislators pass such programs. They're just unaware of the whole idea, and they're not connected to it. And so that's what we're trying to do at Choice Media, is increase that awareness.
What a great place to end it for today. And Bob, that was a great presentation, and I'm thankful, and I'm sure all of us are, that you're out there doing this, because it's vital for the country's future, our kids' future, and everybody else's. So again, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. And just as a plug, yeah, if anyone who wants to check out our smartphone app, just search Choice Media on your phone. And also, if you want to go to our website, it's choicemedia.tv.
So for those who want to come back next week, we will have the Conservative State Legislators Organization, ALEC, talking about some of those reforms they're going to push in the 50 states that skip Estes. A young man I know from here in Williamsburg, Lena Mary, who now is at ALEC. We will skip a session during the Thanksgiving week, so enjoy your Thanksgiving. And then the next 2 weeks, as we go into December, we'll have the top executive at the LP, Dan Fishman, talking about America's Third Party. And then we'll have one of my favorite topics with UVA's Paul Cantor. He's a Shakespeare professor, but a lot of libertarians know him for his books on classic literature that we all hated in high school, but which I fell in love with through Mencken, because there are a lot of writers from the 1800s that teach you political economy. Theodore Dreiser, Sinclair Lewis, Willa Cather, etc. So Paul Cantor is going to help us learn liberty through literature. I can't wait for that one. That's our preview, Jeff.
Fantastic. And again, everyone, thanks for being here today. Look for some notices about how we get this podcast up and running. So we'll kind of join those ranks, and we'll be back together next week.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Bob. That was very good.
Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome. Thank you.